The Canada-US border is the longest undefended boundary on Earth, stretching nearly 9,000 kilometers. On maps, it looks simple, just a neat line dividing two countries. But behind that line is a story of hidden betrayals, power struggles, and a rivalry that has quietly shaped North America for centuries. What seems like an invisible mark on paper was once a chessboard for empires, a stage for wars, and the cause of neighbor turning against neighbor. Even today, the shadow of this boundary still divides communities, landscapes, and lives. This is the untold story of how the world's friendliest border was born out of secrecy, conflict, and ambition. Walk through border towns like Darby Line, Vermont, and Stanstead, Quebec, and you'll see it. One half of the street belongs to America, the other to Canada. Families, businesses, even libraries are split in two. But this peaceful divide hides a violent past. For centuries, Britain and America clashed over this very line, a rivalry born from empires, fueled by greed, and settled in treaties full of secrets and compromises. Two nations bound by geography, but torn apart by pride. It began in the late 1700s. Britain still ruled Canada, while the US was a young republic desperate to expand. Their citizens lived side by side, often in small farming towns where loyalties were divided. Some families supported the crown, others the Stars and Stripes. When war came, first in 1812, brothers, cousins, even neighbors found themselves on opposite sides of the battlefield. Bloodlines meant little when borders turned into battlefronts. Life was harsh in these frontier towns. Families lived off the land, trading fur, timber, and grain across rivers that didn't yet have checkpoints. But war destroyed trust. Farms were burned, trade routes blocked, and communities torn apart. Out of this chaos, American leaders began pushing northward, convinced the border should move deeper into Canada. Meanwhile, the British clung tightly to their northern colonies, determined never to lose again to the Americans. Then came the Surveyors, men tasked with turning forests, rivers, and lakes into precise lines of ownership. But they had almost nothing to work with. No modern tools, no satellites, not even reliable maps. Instead, they hacked through wilderness, marking borders with stone cairns and wooden posts, often miles off from where the treaties said they should be. In some places, they simply guessed. The result was a border that was as much invention as it was agreement. The mistakes became opportunities. Smugglers used gaps in the line to trade whiskey, lumber, and even slaves. Politicians used disputes to rally their people. And in places like the Great Lakes, the border was so contested that ships armed with cannons would stare each other down, daring the other side to blink first. To ordinary people, this wasn't just politics, it was survival. Entire towns depended on bending the rules of the border. But then came the moment that transformed the invisible line into a symbol. The Treaty of 1818, followed by the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842, and finally the Oregon Treaty in 1846. Each was a negotiation where Britain and America gave up land, traded rights, and in some cases, simply split disputed territory down the middle. One deal even created the famous 49th parallel line, a mathematical border that ignored mountains, rivers, and people, a line drawn with ink that would define nations forever. The deals were made, but resentment remained. In Maine, lumberjacks once fought a bloodless war with axes instead of rifles. In the West, the border cut through indigenous homelands, splitting nations that had existed long before Britain or America. Families found their hunting grounds, sacred sites, and even burial lands suddenly belonging to another country. The border was peaceful on paper, but on the ground, it was still deeply violent. And then came the strangest chapter: Prohibition. When the US banned alcohol in the 1920s, Canada didn't. That thin line across rivers and lakes suddenly became a goldmine for smugglers. Rumrunners and speedboats would load up on Canadian whiskey, dash across the water, and unload for thirsty American cities. Police on both sides played a dangerous game of chase, and sometimes of collaboration. The border had become a highway of shadows. Yet even through wars, disputes, and smuggling, the border evolved into something different, a symbol of peace. During World War II, when Europe burned, the Canada-US border stood open. Goods, troops, and ideas crossed freely. Both nations signed the Ogdensburg Agreement in 1940, pledging mutual defense, a pact that continues to this day. What was once a scar of empire had become a lifeline of trust. But here's the irony. The longer the border stood, the more invisible it became. By the 20th century, the world called it undefended. No armies, no walls, no barbed wire, just forests, prairies, and lakes stretching endlessly between two friendly neighbors. And yet, this undefended border was guarded more by trust than by treaties. A fragile trust, one that could break under the right pressure. Today, we drive across it for vacations, shop for cheaper goods, or visit relatives. But look closer, and the border still carries its ghosts. Indigenous nations continue to fight for recognition across both sides. Small towns remember the feuds of past centuries. And since September 11th, what was once the world's most open border has seen checkpoints tighten and surveillance grow. The invisible line is visible once again. So the next time you see that neat line on a map, remember, it isn't just geography. It's a story of war, betrayal, survival, and reconciliation. A line born in blood, but carried forward in peace. The Canada-US border isn't just the world's longest boundary. It's one of its greatest paradoxes. On the surface, peace seemed permanent. The line between Canada and the US looked settled, but just like the rivalry of two brothers who never forgave, the border kept fueling hidden tensions. Logging rights, fishing waters, and railway routes became constant sparks. The farther west the line stretched, the more complicated it became. Rivers shifted, surveyors disagreed, and maps contradicted one another. Communities would wake up to find their towns suddenly moved to the other country by the stroke of a pen. The greatest strain came in the Pacific Northwest. The British claimed Vancouver Island and the surrounding coast. The Americans insisted their manifest destiny extended to the Pacific. For a while, the two sides actually prepared for war over pigs. Yes, pigs. In 1859, when an American farmer shot a British settler's pig that wandered across the San Juan Islands, soldiers were mobilized. Cannons were positioned. Warships lined the coast. The world nearly saw another Anglo-American war, all over livestock. In the end, cooler heads prevailed, and the so-called pig war ended without a shot fired. But the lesson was clear. The border was still fragile. At the same time, Indigenous nations were paying the highest price. The border carved directly through their homelands, the Blackfoot, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and dozens more. Leaders argued that no treaty signed by foreign powers could erase their right to cross freely, and for generations, many continued to do so. But over time, both Canada and the US tightened controls, cutting through trade networks, seasonal migrations, and even family ties. What was drawn as a line of peace became a wound of division. When the industrial age arrived, the border shifted from military dispute to economic weapon. Railroads crisscrossed North America, and both sides fought to control the flow of goods. For Canadian leaders, the fear was clear. Without strong railways, their economy would be swallowed by the US. That's why Canada pushed the Canadian Pacific Railway to link east and west, not just for trade, but to prove the young country could stand on its own. For the Americans, controlling access to markets became another way to pressure their northern neighbor. Once again, the border was less about maps and more about power. Then came Prohibition's shadow games. From 1920 to 1933, when the US banned alcohol, the border turned into a goldmine for smugglers. Detroit became the hub, right across from Windsor, Ontario. At night, convoys of cars loaded with Canadian whiskey would roar across the frozen Detroit River, headlights off, chased by American police. Elsewhere, boats darted across the Great Lakes, and underground tunnels were dug to funnel liquor south. For Canada, it was a booming business. For the US, it was an endless game of cat and mouse. The invisible line had never been more profitable, But the most important transformation came during World War II. For the first time, the US and Canada recognized the border not as a dividing wall, but as a bridge. In 1940, as Nazi Germany swept across Europe, both nations signed the Ogdensburg Agreement. This pact pledged mutual defense and joint planning, the birth of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. Suddenly, the world's longest undefended border became a backbone of security. What was once drawn in rivalry was now guarded in partnership. Still, the Cold War tested this trust. The Arctic, stretching across the top of Canada, became a new front line. Both the US and Canada feared Soviet bombers might fly over the pole. So together, they built the Dew Line, a chain of radar stations across the frozen tundra. The border didn't stop being relevant. It simply shifted northward into the icy silence. Soldiers, engineers, and Inuit workers endured brutal winters to keep watch over a line that might one day decide the fate of the continent. Yet even as the world modernized, border towns remained strangely old-fashioned. Darby Line, Vermont, and Stanstead, Quebec, shared a single library where Canadians enter through one door and Americans through another. For decades, families straddled the line, crossing back and forth without passports, without fear. The border seemed less like a barrier and more like a neighbor's fence. But all of this would change after one morning in 2001, when airplanes struck New York and Washington. September 11th reshaped everything. Overnight, the US tightened its borders, including the one with Canada. Suddenly, guards, cameras, and checkpoints multiplied. Trusted crossings became choked with delays. Truck drivers faced hours-long waits. Families needed passports to see relatives a few streets away. The world's friendliest border now looked less friendly, and Canadians, once used to easy access, began to feel the invisible weight of suspicion. Today, the Canada-US border is paradoxical. On one hand, it's peaceful, open compared to almost anywhere else. On the other, it's more closely monitored than ever, a line of surveillance stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific and up into the Arctic. Drones patrol, databases track, and sensors monitor every crossing. The line that was once drawn by hand now lives in satellites and algorithms. It may be undefended by armies, but it is defended by data. Yet even now, disputes simmer beneath the surface. Fishermen in the Atlantic still clash over lobster traps. In the Pacific, the boundary around the Strait of Juan de Fuca remains contested. And in the Arctic, as melting ice opens new shipping lanes, Canada and the US quietly argue over who controls the Northwest Passage. The line may look calm, but like a river in winter, there is tension flowing just beneath the ice. For Indigenous peoples, the fight is even more personal. Many nations, the Mohawk, the Blackfoot, the Cree, insist they never agreed to this line at all. They argue that their sovereignty predates Britain, predates America, predates the treaties that divided their homelands. Court cases continue today, pressing for the right to cross freely, to restore traditions broken by a border they never drew. For them, the longest undefended border is still very much a battlefield, not of weapons, but of identity and justice. And then there is the cultural paradox. Canadians and Americans consume the same movies, cheer for the same sports, listen to the same music, and vacation in each other's cities. In many ways, the border feels invisible. Yet ask the people of Windsor and Detroit, or Stanstead and Darby Line, and they'll tell you, the border is always there. It shapes how towns grow, where businesses trade, and how families connect. It is both a bridge and a wall, depending on which side you stand. So what do we make of it, this 8,891-kilometer line that has survived wars, smuggling, treaties, and terrorism? Some call it a triumph, proof that two nations can share the world's longest boundary without violence. Others call it an illusion, a reminder that peace depends not on lines, but on the fragile trust of the people who live along them. Like Adidas and Puma, like brothers divided by ambition, Canada and the US remain tied together, forever looking across a line that defines them both. In the end, the Canada-US border is more than geography. It is a living story of betrayal and reconciliation, of division and cooperation, of silence and dialogue. It is the line that made North America and the mirror through which both nations see themselves. The world calls it the longest undefended border, but maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's proof that history, even when written in blood, can bend toward peace. And yet, one question lingers. If this invisible line could vanish tomorrow, would the two nations grow closer, or would centuries of rivalry rise again? That perhaps is the hidden history still waiting to be written.